Hi, my name is Matt Jensen, and I'm from Chess Goals. This is our 10 chapter course on the dynamic Caro-Kann, and we may have a few bonus chapters with model games or additional lines in the future. And the way that this course is designed, each of the 10 chapters should approximately be about 10% of your games in the Caro-Kann. And within each of the 10 chapters, we aim for approximately 10 lines per chapter. And my co-host here is Jesse. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Jesse.
Hi everyone, I'm Jesse. I also do some work at Chess Goals. Um, I'm rated about 1300 over the board, so I have some learning to do to get to Matt's level. But we're going through the Caro-Kann together, and it's been a really fun opening to play.
In chapter one here, we're starting out with the most popular variation that we'll see in the Caro-Kann, and that's the advanced variation with 3e5. So the idea with 3e5 is white wants to take extra control of the center and make it difficult for us to get our minor pieces developed.
Yep, and I've been playing the Caro for, I don't know, probably a couple months in my online games, and I see the advanced most of the time. I think I said in our last video is about half the time that I'm seeing the advanced, and then from here you see all kinds of different stuff, and we cover pretty much everything after E5 because this is really what we're going to see in the vast majority of our games, so it's pretty important to get these lanes down.
Yes, so the recommended move that we're going for in this course is 3c5. The idea with c5 is we're immediately putting the pressure on this d4 pawn, and it scores very well in the database for club level players. And also, the nice thing with c5 is it's not the most common move. So bishop f5 is typically the most popular move here. We're going with something a bit offbeat, but also it's going to follow in line with our repertoire and being dynamic, and we're going to put the pressure on white right from move 3.
Yeah, so a lot of the thought that went into this repertoire is to play for the initiative and play to get the game in your court as early as possible. And this C5 move really does a trick. First thing is that it does score very well. The computer approves of it, but it immediately puts the test to white. Are they going to capture this pawn? Are they going to defend the pawn? Are they going to defend the pawn in a different way? And already we're in a pretty rare line on move three. So I think we have a million games in the database with what we're working with. And after this move C5, we're down to about 3,500 around there. So you can see we're already way down the opening tree, and we're going to see this a lot of the times in our game. So just with these kind of this, just with that setup alone, we should be much more prepared with C5 than our opponent. And I feel like we're going to have very good fighting chances and winning chances.
And one thing I like about this repertoire as well is we're going to go through all the common moves that your opponents will play. So these are not necessarily the very top grandmaster moves that we're showing all the time and trying to prove some sort of advantage at the top level of play. We're showing you typical mistakes that your opponents will make, but also the common moves that they play that the grandmasters play as well. So in this position, the top move at grandmaster level tends to be d takes c5, and we'll be covering that in our next chapter. But the most common move that you will see in your games is probably pawn to c3. This is a very solid move, but it's not as testing as the d takes c5 line. And one nice thing with this variation is we actually have pretty straightforward plans, and we can eventually develop the c8 bishop outside of our pawn chain before we play e6.
Yep. So that's another good thing about this repertoire is once you kind of know the setup that white is going for, a lot of the plans follow. And I don't want to say transpose, but you see a lot of the same piece placement and a lot of the same kind of immediate plans right out of the opening. And we're going to get pretty familiar positions kind of no matter I don't know depending on what white chooses to do, we're going to have a pretty solid idea of how to respond long term rather than just memorizing the moves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a common theme in these lines is we want to keep putting the pressure on white. So you'll hear me say pressure all the time. That just means we're putting some sort of threats on white, making them make tough decisions. And those tend to lead to mistakes too. So right away here, we saw 3c5, and now on move 4, we're going knight c6. And you can see we're putting 2 attackers on this d4 pawn right away. The most popular move for white here looks very straightforward, makes a lot of sense. It's 5 knight to f3.
Yep, and this is a move. This is an exact position I've had quite a few times already, and um, it does allow us to immediately play the bishop out and pin the knight. Is that the move that we're recommending here?
So that's definitely a good move. I'm going with c takes d4. And the reason I recommend c takes d4 here is because that doesn't allow white to capture our c5 pawn later. So let's say we played bishop g4 here. There might be lines where white can actually get away with taking c5. So I think for simplicity's sake, uh, I'm recommending c takes d4. And really there's only one move for white here. C takes d4 back. And now your move, Jesse, bishop g4, developing the light square bishop, pinning the f3 knight. Go
Yep, a
ahead.
little too jump the gun on the knight pin, but it is a common idea, so just kind of have it in my head. And a lot of the times, white can so in other transpositions of the advanced Caro-Kann, white can make an opening mistake by like playing this move too early, and it allows us to free our bishop with an immediate pin. And since our light squared bishop typically is weaker in the Caro or in the Caro-Kann, you can just snatch the knight and play with your dark squared bishop, and you're totally fine. So this is kind of like getting down into the weeds for further variations and other middle game plans. But this is a very common theme, I would say, in the Caro-Kann is pinning this knight here. So bishop g4, very solid move.
And another thing that we'll see is oftentimes in chess, people talk about having the bishop pair and the advantage of having 2 bishops against a bishop and a knight or against 2 knights. But oftentimes in these lines, we're going to trade off our light square bishop for that knight on f3. And we're going to play for that imbalance where we actually have 2 knights. Our opponent only has 1 knight. They have 2 bishops. And we will use our g8 knight to come to e7 or h6, followed by going to f5, which eventually puts the pressure again on the d4 pawn. That's white's weakest pawn on the board. So in this position, there's a few different tries for white. We're going over 4 options, and the most common is bishop e2, which is just trying to break this pin.
Yep. Bishop e2, very natural looking move. This pin is already uncomfortable. If you can imagine if white got, or sorry, if black got a free move here, we could bring the queen out and further pressure this, backwards d pawn. So, yep, and also hit the b2 pawn, which is weak but still defended. So makes total sense to break the pin here, develop a piece, get ready to castle.
Yes, and one thing that I did in this repertoire is I tried to make lines consistent across the variations. So for all 4 moves that we cover for white on the 7th move for bishop e2, I'm recommending e6. So there could be cases where we play queen b6 first. You may see that in other repertoires. I think this is the most straightforward. We just always play e6 no matter what white does on move 7 there.
Yeah, and e6 is also a very thematic move. If you're just in this position for the first time, e6 should jump at you because we need to free up space for this bishop, free up space for this knight, and makes all the sense in the world.
So now the natural move for white is to castle. And here we need to get both of these kingside pieces developed, the knight on g8 and the bishop on f8. The recommended way to do that is to start with the knight, because we can clear out the knight first, usually coming to the f5 square, and then after that we will develop the bishop off of f8.
Yep, and I like how it gives us a little flexibility too with the bishop. So if we go back a move, the only real square we can develop the bishop to that makes sense is b4 here, because you want to leave this square for the knight. I guess you can go knight h6 here, but given our move knight to e7, knight g to e7, now we can bring the bishop here someday, bring it here, or just allows us a little more flexibility, and we're not kind of like showing our hand too early.
Yep, that's right. So the most common move here for white is knight c3. And at this point, we're going to go with knight f5 right away. So following with the plan, uh, putting a second attacker on this d4 pawn, getting the f8 bishop ready to come into the game. And if white ever plays h3, we're going to take on f3. So that's something that you should also keep in mind.
Yep, and at this point, the heat is coming down on this pawn, so white needs to figure out a way to defend it or come up with some fancy tactic in order to make sure we can't just completely pile up on it and win the pawn for free. So white plays another natural looking move here, bishop e3, and I think again this makes all the sense in the world. We of course, can win the bishop. I mean, not win the bishop, but we can trade our knight for the bishop. But we are going to develop our bishop and get ready to castle and just complete our development.
And one thing I didn't mention when we played knight f5, but it's a good time to bring it up now, is oftentimes we want to wait with the bishop on g4 to capture f3 until either h3 is played or until there's some sort of tactical justification. Like maybe we're able to take f3, white takes back, and we win the pawn on d4. So we don't want to rush into taking this knight on f3, even though we know it's pretty much going to happen in every line. So in this position, the most common move is h3, and now we're going to go ahead and take, and white takes back. What do you think of this position, Jesse?
Yep, I like this position a lot. We have a lot of pressure on this weak looking pawn. We can get our bishop pair back at a moment's notice. We're ready to castle. And yeah, I mean, it's just a very standard opening. I don't think white has done anything to really challenge us or really catch us off guard. Every move we've made so far, it's been, even though we have the black pieces and we're moving second, white has been very reactive to how we're playing the game. So immediate c5, they had to make a decision. Then we pinned the bishop over here. How are they going to get rid of the pin? Then we're threatening the pawn. So we've been really pressing already, even though we haven't like won a piece or anything. But if we're playing, let's pretend we're playing an over the board game. When we reach this position, there's a very high percentage of, or a very good chance that we're just way up on the clock, because we know these lines. White is going to have to be thinking with every single move. And so aside from us having a very solid position, we have a bit of like a psychological edge or a prep edge, and maybe even a edge on the clock as well.
That's a really good point, Jesse. I'm glad you made it. So another thing that we're going to try to do in this repertoire is keep the game in our court. We want positions that we're more comfortable with than our opponents, and we want plans that are very similar to other variations that we've seen. So this position is pretty interesting. I found an idea here while doing some research that I haven't seen before. So if we think about this position in terms of the imbalances, you might say that the bishop on e3 is the worst piece for white. So why would we want to rush into playing knight takes e3? Knight takes e3 is actually a pretty good move here. There's nothing wrong with playing it. But I found this idea, bishop g5, and I gave it an exclamation point in the notes. The reason bishop g5 is so strong is because if white were to take it, and we take back with the queen, there's actually a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn, and white might just end up losing that pawn outright. So we're taking away one of the defenders of the d4 pawn, and we're trading off our bishop, which is sort of a bad piece, even though he's opposite color of our pawns in the center. That bishop on e7 is not a great piece, and we want to be left with the two knights that both pressure this pawn on d4. So bishop g5 is the recommended move here, and I think it's a really strong idea, and it will probably take your opponents by surprise.
Yeah, this is A move. So I just flipped the engine on just a second ago, and it says equal position. But I like this bishop g5 idea a lot because let's look at white's biggest weakness. The weakness we've been targeting for most of this game is d4. So right now we have two attackers of d4 with our minor pieces, and this bishop is never really going to have a good way to attack here. We could, bring our queen up, move our bishop back, move our bishop here, but that's a really long maneuver. But trading off, what should be a good bishop actually gives us a big advantage, because white no longer has this key dark square bishop to defend the pawn. So now we have two two minor, so let's say the bishops are off the board. We have two minor pieces that can bear down on this pawn, but white can only defend it with one of their minor pieces. So this is a minor piece idea, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it's just it's a very interesting plan. I like it a lot.
And the most common move here for white is playing queen to d2. So guarding this bishop a second time, pawn and queen both guard. And here we're going to recommend taking the bishop. White will take back with the f-pawn. And now we go with another aggressive move, queen to g5. And this move has two threats. There's the obvious capture on e3 with either queen or knight. But we also have another threat, knight takes d4. And this shot could come as a shock to your opponent because it's very hard to see knight takes d4 coming when it's defended by a pawn. But white cannot capture back because they'll lose the queen in the end.
Comes as a shock to me, I will say, but that's a very cool move. So obviously, if white takes with the queen, we win the queen. White takes with the pawn, they're pinned. So it's a nice geometry of the board here, and this is already looking pretty hairy because white has this awkward looking pawn here. We already have some pieces kind of circling around the king, a queen and knight around the king. So there's some threats here, and like you said, we're just attacking this pawn right now.
Yeah, so the most common way to defend this is rook a to e1. And at this point, there's two good moves that you could play. You could take on d4 with the knight. Actually, either knight could take, so I'll say three good moves. And those lines get very sharp because what white can do is they can sacrifice their bishop back on d5. And that's something that you could look into if you're interested in a real tactical line. You want a sharp line against your opponent. But the recommended move in our repertoire is to simply castle. And the nice thing about this is we are now renewing this threat of knight takes d4. So it just gives your opponent another chance to make a mistake.
Yeah, I like that it kind of keeps the tension too. So, like we said, we can win this pawn, but then they can take back here, and now we're kind of in this weird, um, you know, like the king of the intermediate moves, right? Like who's going to have the better intermezzo? But keeping the tension, it's still we're keeping all our threats, getting our king to safety. Makes a ton of sense to me. So follow. So next move here is queen d3, and that's to, I assume, to get out of this pin.
Yep, that's correct. So that's the most common move here. And now we're recommending rook a to d8. The reason rook a to d8 is recommended is because queen d3 also has another small threat. White was thinking they could possibly play bishop takes d5, and if we have to take back with the pawn, there's now a double attack on the f5 knight. So rook a to d8 just makes sure that our position's extra safe. And now our plan is actually going to be to play on the king side. So I was researching some different lines here, and the lines tended to have the knight coming to e7, followed by the knight headed to g6, and then actually pushing the h-pawn up the board and creating a bit of a king-side attack. So this is something that you could look for going forward. And one thing that we like to do in this repertoire is we try to show a plan at the end of every line.
Yep, exactly. Something that was kind of a rule that we set in stone is we're never going to leave you in a position and say figure it out. So we have very good plans at the end of every line that we give, and Matt just demonstrated a very nice plan here. We have a lot of pieces around white's king. White's king is already looking a little open, with the F pawn being capturing towards the center, and with this H3 move. Um, Another thing I want to point out about this line is this is 16 lines long, and this is, or sorry, 16 moves long, and this is about as deep as we'll go into a line. So this is the main line, kind of where we're going to base everything off of. And so this is kind of the trunk of our tree, and we're going to build up from here.
That's a good point. A lot of our lines, we try to go right around 10, 12 moves, maybe 14 moves, depending on if it's something where we haven't quite reached a settling point. But we don't want you to spend too much time memorizing 20 moves deep in every single line. One thing that we found in Chess Goals data is that you don't want to spend too much time studying the opening, so we really focus on getting the general ideas down, finding lines that put the game in your court, tough questions to your opponent, and we want things that are pretty easy to play once you know them. So now let's trace back to the beginning and go to our first sideline. So we're going to go through these moves again, starting with e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, most common move you'll see, knight c6, knight f3, takes, pin, bishop e2, e6, so we're always playing e6 after bishop g4. And now in this position, there's a very common mistake, h3. What do you think of this move, Jesse?
Um, it does look premature to me because um, we already kind of want to capture this knight, right? So it's kind of forcing us to play the move that we already want to play. And if white would just leave us alone, maybe at some point in the future we would take without prompting. So it seems kind of just like a waste of a move. Furthermore, it removes a defender of this pawn here, so we can be able. I mean, we're going to be able to attack it pretty rapidly coming up.
Yeah, so usually white should play bishop e3 before they kick our bishop with the h3 pawn, just to have another defender on d4. So now we're going to see why this is a mistake. Bishop takes f3, bishop takes back, and now we have this really strong move, queen b6, with a double attack, pawn on b2, pawn on d4, and the poor bishop on c1 is stuck trying to figure out which pawn to defend.
Yep, and it's not a super easy decision to decide which pawn to defend because do you want to save your center pawn or do you want to allow queen capturing here, intruding, hitting your knight? So here we're just winning a pawn, and white's already in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, definitely. So main move is bishop e3, and now we're going to go ahead and take the b2 pawn. And at this point, now that we're up the pawn, all we want to do is secure the position and get our queen back to safety. So keep an eye on different ways that your opponent might try to trap your queen, and just always make sure that she can get back to safety. So I'll show the main line that we have in the repertoire. Knight d2, knight f5, so another attacker on the d4 pawn. And now here, if the immediate rook b1 is played, we can actually take the a2 pawn, and that's a better variation for us than if white does not play rook b1, because even if the rook comes down to b7, we actually have a passed a pawn in the end. So that pawn is going to be very strong in the endgame. So the most common move here is knight to b3, sort of trying to trap the queen. So what do you recommend here, Jesse?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you explained the fall or the I guess the counter argument to the immediate rook b1 because when I'm in these positions typically, I really don't want to allow white's rook to come in, capture our pawn, and then just kind of live on the seventh rank. But I did not see, of course, that we can take the a pawn, and now our a pawn is super dangerous. So it gets back to the regular positions. So after, um, okay, so last move just played was sorry, knight b3. So now I feel like it's time to move our queen. We kind of need to get out of the way of this rook attack. So I think I would probably go to a3 just to kind of keep all these squares. Well, I guess these two squares available for our queen, and we can retreat down the a file as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's also a very safe square for our queen here on a4. So if white plays like bishop c1 here, for example, queen a4 is a nice move in reply. And now our plan is pretty straightforward. We're going to develop this bishop to e7 and get castled. We're up a pawn, put the rooks on the c file, go for trades, and probably try to expand with our queenside pawns because we have 2 versus 1 majority over there, and we can try to make use of our extra pawn.
Yep, makes sense. So if we jump back to this position here, so we can kind of go through the moves again real quickly. And in this position, we just covered h3 and why that's a just a bad move. We
Yeah,
get a free pawn.
and a common bad move. That's a common mistake that
Yeah.
you'll see in your games. So now the next branching point is move 7, bishop to b5.
Okay, so back up a little bit. Okay, so yep. In this move, or sorry, in this position, here's bishop b5. There we go. So attacking our knight, pinning our knight, and yeah, so in some other lines, we have already played e6 and we block with the bishop, but here we have a lot more flexibility. This does look pretty aggressive, but what is white really threatening? Do they want to take our knight? We can just capture back and push someday. So it looks, they're kind of coming into our side of the board, but I don't think there's anything to fear here. We can continue with our normal plan of playing e6, and we're getting, very similar looking positions with each of these lines.
Yeah, so again, e6 we're playing right away after our bishop comes out to g4. Like Jesse said, if white takes c6 with the bishop, we're taken back with the b pawn, and we'll probably play c5 later. So the bishop on b5 is not real scary. The most common move is to castle, and now we go ahead with our similar plan to when that we saw in the bishop e2 lines. We're going with knight e7. We'll make a natural developing move for white with knight c3. And now again we see knight f5. So we're not in a rush to take this knight on f3, even though we know it could happen down the line. We're just going to put the knight on f5, apply more pressure to the d pawn, and continue our kingside development next.
Yep, and I think in possibly every line in this chapter, we're always going to develop the knight first, kind of like standard opening principles to develop the knight first, and like I said, clear this path for the bishop, so they have a little more flexibility with our bishop and getting our knight to a really nice square on f5. And some other lines, we do bring our knight to g6, but it's not really doing anything because this pawn is well defended. So knight f5 is a much better square, ramping up the pressure on d4.
And usually we'll see the knight head to g6 when the d pawn is already gone for white. So that
Yeah.
means the weakest pawn will be e5, and it makes sense for a knight to attack it.
Hmm.
So here the most common reply is bishop e3. We're recommending bishop e7. Now the interesting thing with this position, Jesse, is this bishop on b5 actually probably wishes he was back on d3 or e2 right now. So he's not doing anything on the b5 square. And then our
Hmm.
plan in the next few moves is going to be to castle and play f6 as a way to break open the center. And if white recaptures on f6, we take with the bishop.
Yep. Another very common idea with this advanced advanced e pawn is playing f6 and undermining and getting our bishop on a much more active diagonal. Looking this way, imagine this d pawn's here, more pressure. Sorry, imagine the e pawn's not here, more pressure on the d pawn. We can always take here and remove a defender. So yeah, very common idea, one to put away in your memory bank.
So let's go back to when we first pinned the knight with bishop g4. And now we're going to look at the next variation for white, which is bishop to e3. And this is just another attempt to defend the d4 pawn, preparing for future tactics. And again, we'll go with our standard plan, e6. And after white keeps developing, we have knight e7, bishop e2, and you can probably guess which move is next. We've seen it in the other
Knight
lines.
f5.
Knight f5, exactly. And now we have an interesting position. If white castles here kingside, which is probably the most common move, this will actually transpose directly back to the bishop e2 lines on move 7. So one nice thing about our repertoire too is because we're keeping these lines consistent, sometimes we save some of the theory that you have to memorize because lines can transpose back, depending on what your opponent does.
Mhm. Yep, yeah, exactly. And we've seen, keeping true to our promise, E6 every single time after we pin the knight, always bringing the knight out, always bringing the knight up, simply applying pressure to the weakest pawn on the board, and just kind of following through on our ideas, and keeping the game in our court. One thing I noticed is every single line we've gone through, we're always talking about, okay, what pieces are we attacking? How are we applying pressure to these pawns? What's like an active square for a queen? But never once have we thought about, oh, we need to defend this pawn because now white's attacking it, or now we have to find some tactical solution to get our bishop in the game or something like that. It's all like, here's our pressure, here's our ideas, try to find the best way to deal with it.
Yeah, and we're not biased at all. So we could flip the board and we
Yeah,
would be saying this is no fun for white.
yeah, exactly.
So we have one last line to look at for white on move 7, and that's knight c3. So again, we go with our standard plan, e6 after we played the bishop to g4. And now here we see another common mistake, a premature h3 by white.
Yep. Very similar to the last time we saw this move, is we already want to capture this knight. We're kind of waiting actually for white to play a move like this we can just capture. So follow-up move is capture, and they cannot capture with the queen because this poor d pawn has no defenders. So now white's really gotta take a hard look in the mirror and figure out how they let their pawns look so sad. We have a lot of pressure on this d pawn still, and white has no good place to castle. I mean, does the white want to go queen side? That looks like pretty open. King side looks even more open. I think black has just everything to play for.
White does have the bishop pair, though. We have to give them some
Yeah,
credit, right?
I guess they did get the bishop pair, sure.
So now we go forward with our standard plan, knight e7, and now that knight's headed to f5, double attacking the pawn on d4. So white sees that coming, bishop e3, and we can still go ahead with the plan, knight f5. And you can tell here, even though white has the bishop pair, these bishops are really having trouble getting active. And at this point, there's a common mistake for white. Do you know what it is, Jesse?
I have the moves in front of me, so I
Good.
can say with I can say with confidence, Bishop D3. So this is a common mistake, I can tell, because now the queen no longer defends the pawn. So we want to snatch this pawn as soon as we can. And does it make a difference which knight we take with?
I believe taking with the c knight is a bit more accurate, but I think you could take either way.
Yeah, I like taking with the Yeah, I just turned Stockfish on to see if there was a big difference. Looks like both night captures are just fine.
Okay.
It does prefer the C night capturing, but I don't immediately see why. But it makes sense, kind of keeping more pieces and more tension on the board. And now we're eyeing up this other weak pawn, and I don't think White ever really wants to take either of these knights because they're on such good outpost squares. So you can see we have dominating knights here, and just on kind of like highlighting, I guess, the weakness of having such an advanced pawn is you leave holes in your position, and our knights have filled those holes, and now we have very great outposts of knights.
Yeah, and if we go back a couple moves, even if white doesn't make this mistake with bishop d3, we have some nice threats here. Knight takes e3, f pawn takes back, queen h4 check, which would force the white king to move, which that's very uncomfortable. We also have ideas of queen b6, again just pressuring our two favorite pawns to attack b2 and d4.
Yep, yeah, for sure. So was that the last line after after bishop g4?
Yeah, so let's run it back to the
Yep.
beginning now. Let's go to the start. So half of
Okay.
this repertoire was on move 5 knight f3. Next we're going through other variations at move 5. And one thing that Jesse and I realized, so the first video we did, we're moving to bonus content. That was on D takes C5 in the Caro Advance. One thing we realized, Jesse's been playing a lot of games online, players tend to deviate early on. And that's what gave us the idea to start looking at these probabilities. What are you most likely to see in your games? So we don't want to give you all these branching points 10 moves deep into theory. That's not what you'll be seeing in your games. We want to show you what your opponents are doing on move 5, move 6, move 7. Those are the lines that you tend to see.
Yep, exactly. And kind of how we've explained too is once you see the setup the white is going for, your plans are very similar throughout. And we don't want to, you can kind of figure out based on other plans we've seen the weak pawns to attack, where to put your pieces in order to put pressure on those pawns. So it doesn't make sense to go over move 18 variations in the Caro-Kann.
Right. So now we're going to see a variation on move 5. Instead of knight f3, which we've already looked at, we're looking at 5 bishop to b5. This is not a popular move at the highest levels, but this is the second most popular move at the club level. So this is something you'll see quite a bit. And I was trying to research why is this move not played by grandmasters. And there's this very interesting idea that makes this move uncomfortable for white, and that's queen to a5, attacking the bishop, but also pinning this c3 pawn to white's king. So this could already take your opponent out of book. This is not the most popular move. Now they have to figure out, how do we react to queen a5?
Yeah, and this is another move where we're kind of like asking White a question is what are you going to do about this bishop? Do you want to take? Because double pawns shouldn't bother us at all. We can always take here and undouble our pawns and actually, free up a little more space for our bishop too. And yeah, this pawn is pinned too. So if we're going to, maybe force the bishop, well, now we have the bishop pair. So we're kind of putting, again, asking White the question of how are we going to deal with this threat. Most common move is just to take it, because if they retreat, what did they prove?
Yeah.
So they have to pretend like this is the plan the whole time. So they take, only move to take back, and yeah. So I see the comment. These are useful double pawns. We can undouble at any time. If they capture here, maybe we can capture back with our bishop and develop it to a very active square. Yeah, does this line go? Yeah, I see a couple variations of this line from here.
Yeah, so there's the main line knight f3, but there's this common mistake that showed up in the database. It actually was played, I believe, just as often as knight f3 at the club level. And I don't know why it's played, but we have to look at it. Bishop to d2. So now after bishop to d2, we can do our favorite thing with the queen, double attack. Pawn on d4, pawn on b2, and we already have a pretty comfortable advantage. So I'll just show a sample line what could happen here. Queen c2, kind of a cool move. If we do take on d4, c takes back, their queen will be hitting our c6 pawn after our queen takes d4. So something to keep in mind, just some tactics there. But now we can go ahead with simple development. e6, knight f3, and here we have a really cool move. We can stop castling.
Oh, yep, I see. So bishop h6, and White does not have a good way to get out of this. This knight is a long ways from blocking. You push, can't really do anything about it. So very irritating move. And we're going to have a lot of moves here where White is just going to try to untangle and try to get castled.
That's exactly right. And then our plan going forward, this knight on g8 can either go to h6 or e7. We don't have to worry about the double pawns on h6. So then we'll do rook c8, c takes d, bishop can probably develop to e7, and then this pawn can come up to c5. So that's kind of the standard plan, very similar to other lines. But the benefit we have in this line is we have this uncontested bishop on a6 that's just piercing through white's position. So you should be very happy if you get this line in your games.
Yeah, this is a big highlight of White's mistake to take the knight, because now we have a very beastly bishop here that just has, all the scope, playing a very important role here on a6.
So let's back up to the point where white just played bishop takes c6. We took back, and now we'll go with a more standard looking move, knight f3. I think you're more likely to see this in your games, even though bishop d2 happened quite a bit in the database. base.
Yeah, and we were talking about a position similar to this, but not quite this exact position earlier in the video. And here, or maybe it was even before that we were recording, I don't remember. But here we want to take the pawn, and this looks a little unintuitive to me, but it makes sense given yep, exactly. So this pawn is pinned and they're forced to capture back with the knight or the queen, and I feel like our pieces are just kind of coming into the game very rapidly. We're going to have a tempo, pawn break here in the future. um Anything else to say about this pawn capture?
Oh, I just realized why players play bishop d2. It's so that they can play c takes d4 back if we take on d4. It wasn't
Yep.
intuitive to me at first, but yeah, so now what's going to happen is they cannot take with the c pawn, and that'll leave their pawn on e5 weak as well. So that's one really nice thing with this line. So here after knight takes d4, there's immediate pressure on our pawn on c6, but we don't have to guard this pawn right away. We can actually use tactics and play e6. If knight takes c6, we have this cool move queen c7, double attacking the knight and the pawn on e5. So it does not make sense for white to take here.
I think at club level you would always see knight takes here.
Probably.
This is such a hard retreating double attack move to see. And but yeah, that's another handy move. Like, oh, you wanna win or pawn? Well, now we get to win with check, and you know we're in control again. So tricky move here. I like it.
Yeah, so here we'll most likely see castling, just get developed. And now we go with our standard plan of knight e7. And in this position, because there's no d4 pawn for white, the weakest pawn on the board is e5. So knowing that, we're going to want this e7 knight to head to g6. So that's kind of the plan.
Yep, very common idea. I guess a good rule of thumb is when this d pawn is missing, you want to attack the weak e pawn. When the d pawn is here, then you want to bring your knight up to f5, and then you can attack the weak d pawn.
So the most common move here for white is pawn to b4. And the reason we're showing this is just to give an example line of what could happen, because there's still a lot of pieces to get developed. So after b4, we recommend tucking the queen back on c7. Dual purpose, guards our pawn on c6, and also pressures the pawn on e5. And the most common move for white is rook e1 to guard this pawn. And now we'd continue with our development, knight g6. And the plan here is pretty standard. We're going to play bishop here, we're going to castle, and that pawn on e5 is going to be a nice target. And once we feel developed on the king side, then we can go for moves like c5 or a5 and try to break down the queen side, finally opening up our bishop pair.
And when there's a lone pawn here on e5, this f6 idea doesn't have as much sting because white can just trade out the pawn. Is that another good rule of thumb, or is that a plan we want to take up in the future in some lines?
I agree with that. I think there's no reason to play f6 here because that pawn is so weak on its own. But if we were ready to play it, let's say we had bishop e7, castle, that rook came over to e8. I could definitely see playing for f6 just to open up our bishop. So it's a good point, Jesse, and I think it's something to keep in mind. It's a standard plan in this structure still.
Yeah, cool.
All right, so now we get into a fun variation. We're going to go all the way back to move 5. So
All these variations have been fun.
That's true. But now white's really opening up their position. Pawn to f4. This is actually the third most popular move here in this position, pawn to f4. The c1 bishop is now trapped in by an additional pawn on the dark squares, and it also opens up this diagonal to white's king, and if white's king is castled, there's this diagonal opened up to the king. So just bad for tactics all around playing f4 for white.
Yeah, it's I feel like it's kind of a trendy move, like just defend, move forward, start a kingside attack. But yeah, like you said, you just highlighted all the reasons why. All these dark squares are just very weak in white's camp, and it's an ugly move to try to, it's like fun to play in the moment, but like in 6 moves you can be like, I shouldn't have played f4.
Yeah, it's one of those moves that works in blitz, but as soon as the time control gets a little bit slower, your opponents take advantage of it. So
Yeah.
we're going to take this pawn right away. C takes d. c takes d. The reason we take it right away is because we know this pawn is weak. We're not giving white any chance to take us on c5. We're just going for that straight away. And now we need to get the bishop outside of the pawn chain. Idea is to play e6 next.
Yep, I like it a lot. So an important point I think on taking the pawn here, if we just follow our standard line, I'll just make a nothing move for white. Here, now white can take here, and it's a little awkward because they don't have this, terrible pawn that we can play against. We're still going to win it back, although maybe not. So I like the immediate capture and just saying, okay, deal with this weak pawn for the next 20 moves, right?
Yeah, it's just unnecessary to make it too messy. This is just an easy way to get the structure we want out of the opening. So in this position, after c takes d4 back, bishop f5 is recommended. We have two moves for white, knight f3 and knight c3. So let's start with knight to f3. And these moves can transpose. So I'm going to show knight f3 without knight c3, and then we'll look at knight c3, which can bring in knight f3 in as well. So similar to the other lines we looked at, as soon as our bishop gets outside the pawn chain, on the very next move, we go e6. So nice similar plan that we've seen before. Keeps things familiar to us.
Yep. So sticking with our common theme, get the bishop out of the pawn chain and then play e6 to lock it in. Difference here is that we're not attacking and pinning this knight. We're on an active diagonal here. Sorry, here, didn't see my arrow. And so so a slightly different structure, but yeah, it's still, a very good position. I have Stockfish on right now. It says black is already a little better, and white still has all the weaknesses we talked about. This weakness is, or this diagonal is weak. Lots of weak dark squares around white's king.
And the most common move here for white, besides knight c3, which we'll cover next, is bishop to d3, offering a trade of bishops, and white's trying to get castled quickly. And a nice thing here to keep in mind is we don't have to take the bishop on d3. So even though we see white's threatening to take us and double our pawns, it's usually better to develop this g8 knight either to h6 or e7. In this case, we're going to go to h6 because that leaves the e7 square free for our bishop.
Yep, I like that. If we do commit to knight e7, now we're kind of in, like, we're just waiting for them to take us. But white doesn't have to take us, and they can just saddle us with a very awkward bishop for a while. So yeah, I like this handy knight h6 moves to defend the bishop.
So now the most common move for white is to castle. And here we're going to start putting some pressure on white. Queen to b6. Not only are we eyeing this d4 pawn, we're also eyeing this king on g1 through the diagonal. And this is very uncomfortable for white because our queen also hits this b2 pawn. So white has to figure out, how do I deal with these tactics?
And again, if white takes our bishop, we capture back with the knight. Now there's just another attacker. So lots of pressure here. And again, there's this pawn is pinned, this pawn is weak.
And this is a position where your opponents are very likely to make a mistake, either on this move or on the next move or two. The strongest move might be king h1. And it's a way to defend the d4 pawn with tactics, because now if we take with the knight on d4, there's bishop e3 pinning that knight back to our queen, and things are getting complicated. So the way that we solve this issue is we take on d3. So now that it makes sense to take on d3, we do it. And then knight f5, putting an additional attacker on the d4 pawn. So now we have 3 pieces attacking the d4 pawn. White only has 2 defenders. And again, we're playing for the initiative.
Yep, for sure. And I guess a sane move here is defending the pawn with the rook. So rook d1. We can follow up with rook c8, just getting a rook on a nice, open file. And our pieces are all beautifully placed. White's king is tucked away in the corner. And yeah, I think again we just have a lot of the initiative and all the threats in the position.
And thinking in terms of what plans we want going forward, If you want to play this position very aggressively, there's ideas like knight b4, maybe sink a piece into c2. So your opponent could make a blunder here as well. That would allow a knight b4, knight c2 tactic. You can also push the h pawn and leave your king in the center. It looks strange at first sight, but there's this common motive where if you have this h pawn coming down the board with the rook behind it, and the knight sort of eyeing this g3 square, in addition to the queen hitting this g1 diagonal, there's a lot of tactics in the air. And another nice thing with this position, if you just want to play it safely, queen to a6 is a very nice move too. Even though it offers double pawns, in this endgame, the d4 pawn is going to be super difficult to defend for white. And it's actually very easy for us. We could play king d7 after the queen trade. Our king's not in danger. Bishop e7. Get both rooks playing on the queen side. Maybe even play our f6 idea that we've talked about before. But this game is
Mhm.
definitely in black's favor, and black is having all the fun in this position.
Yep, yeah, I agree. So I always like how we can end each and every line with a plan. This is even talking about like how to win an end game in this position, right? Queen a6, trade the queens, attack the weak pawn, and we just win the end game. So we it's important to know some opening theory, but what's more important in my opinion is knowing how to handle the position once you get the moves on the board.
And one thing I think we'll do too, Jesse, is once we have this course posted, we'll encourage feedback from our users. You know, which lines are they seeing in their games that they have questions on? And we'll find ways to get that information out to you, whether it's YouTube videos, additional PGN files, or posting lines in the forums. We'll make sure to keep covering lines that you see in your games that aren't covered in the original videos.
Yep, and if you buy the repertoire and you're seeing a bunch of lines and a bunch of users are seeing the same lines, maybe we just add a chapter with here's all the stuff we should have added, and once you buy the repertoire, you'll get all those updates forever.
Yes. So let's back up to move 6, bishop f5. So again, we're in this 5 f4 variation. And here we're going to look at the other knight move, knight to c3. We go with our typical plan, e6, and now knight f3. So this can come with knight f3 first and then knight c3. It transposes exactly to this position.
Cool. Yep, and then so I see the recommended move here is rook c8, very natural looking move, getting the rook over, eyeing up this nice open file, and kind of waiting it out with our kingside development here. I think again this this knight e7 move here is a bit awkward because normally we want to bring the knight. So uh, white has this pawn structure. We normally want to bring our knight to the bishop or to the square where the bishop is. Doesn't really make any sense to bring it to bishop to bring the knight to g6 because this pawn is defended, completely locking in our bishop and susceptible to just getting that piece trapped. So this is kind of like a nice waiting move and still a nice solid move that makes total sense.
And the most common move here is bishop to d3, which kind of proves the usefulness of rook c8, because now we see again these two bishops lined up. And because of that, we know where we want the knight. We want this knight on h6 to free up the e7 square for the bishop.
Yep, same type of idea as the last line. So knight here is awkward because our bishop is trapped in. Knight on h6, we can defend the bishop very comfortably and free up our bishop and our king to castle.
And one cool idea that we have here is this is the good bishop for white, the bishop on d3. We may play bishop g4 and knight f5. So rearranging these pieces a little bit. Remember, we couldn't play this bishop to g4 originally because the f3 knight was not out yet, so white's queen would have just captured us. But the g4 square is actually a little bit better for this bishop. So after the most common move, castling, we're recommending this move, bishop g4. We already have an immediate threat of taking the pawn on d4.
Very irritating move to see bishop g4 on the board. If I was playing one, I'm like, man, we are just going to trade those bishops, and now like I'm in an uncomfortable position.
Yeah,
And now it's getting a little hairy if white wants to kick the bishop because now he's move two pawns around his king, we still have a dark square bishop that's gonna kind of eat up all these dark squares around the king. So tricky move here, and we get the knight into a nice square that we want it to. So yeah, very, very nice and handy maneuver here. I like it a lot.
And the most common move is knight e2, which is natural, defending this d4 pawn in extra time. We're recommending knight f5, which not only hits this d4 pawn a second time, but also guards this e3 square, so the white bishop cannot safely come here, defending the d4 pawn. So at this point, you should be able to pick up this pawn on d4 for free. But one thing I will say is white does have some compensation for this pawn. So you do have to be aware of tactics. Keep an eye on different tactical shots that white could attempt. But really, your plan is pretty straightforward. You want bishop e7. You want to get castled, secure your extra pawn. It'll be an extra protected pass pawn, which is going to be very strong headed into the endgame.
Yeah, that concludes this line. Do we have another branching point?
One more variation. I'll run it back to
Okay.
the... Okay, so here's c5, c3, knight c6. So the last branching point is move 5, bishop to e3.
Okay.
In this position, I looked at a few different lines, and the strongest line appears to be knight to h6. It goes a little bit away from what we tend to recommend, but bishop e3 is also such a different looking move for white. The reason knight h6 is strong is because this bishop does not want to move twice just to take us, and we would also have the bishop pair. And now we're looking at knight to g4 and knight to f5 ideas. Both would attack this bishop immediately.
Yep, so this is really the only move in this whole chapter that looks a little weird.
Yeah,
This wasn't prompted, so this is just one kind of move to look out for. But also, bishop, what is it? Bishop e3 also looks a little weird too. So makes total sense. I don't think we're afraid of this at all. We can just put our bishop here and maybe even use the open G file someday. And so, yeah, just a move to consider. And also, like Matt said, we're attacking these two squares, just an immediate threat on the bishop.
and the most common move for white here is bishop to d3. And at this point, we're going with knight f5 right away. So we have a triple attack on the pawn on d4, and we have knight takes e3 threatened. And there's not a great way for white to deal with this besides just trying to continue development.
So here we capture the bishop, take back, and now we go with a, a fianchetto line with our bishop. Is that kind of where we're heading?
Yeah, so like Jesse said earlier, this is a very odd variation compared to the others. But the reason these moves are recommended is because we have a chance to take advantage of bishop e3. So we don't want to recommend subpar moves just to stick with the standard plan. We have g6 here with the idea bishop to h6. And we can also go queen to b6. So we can kind of come out from the sides and really attack this pawn structure that white has and attack his weaknesses, his or her weaknesses.
Mhm. Yep. So we're recommending here a line that isn't common and doesn't fit with all of our ideas, but that's because white has made a pretty bad opening mistake. So I'm looking at the engine right now. It says negative zero point 0.7 for black. So we want to be able to pounce on that immediately. So, you know, we have all these plans for all these other lines. If we need to memorize or it's like know of one line to look out for to really get the game like really in our hands, totally worth it. And at chess schools, we'd recommend, or I guess we have found that people spend way too much time studying the opening, and especially at people at
Us
my
included.
level. Yeah, us included, me included, especially people at my level. So that's what's great about the Caro is you don't need to do a ton of study. You don't need to take out some daunting 3,000 line, opening tutorial or opening course. We're recommending 100 lines, and every now and then there's something to really look out for.
Yeah, so let's quickly run through what could happen in this line. Castling is the most common move. We're going to play bishop h6, immediately hitting this pawn on e3, queen e2, and now castle. And sort of like I was talking about before, the plans here are typically f6, chipping away at the center, which helps open up the position for our bishop pair, and queen to b6. But the main thing to keep in mind is that imbalance. We have the bishop pair. We want to chip away at these white pawns and open up the position.
Yeah, for sure. I like how in a lot of these lines, when we get the bishop pair, we can really make something of it. So here, this dark square bishop is so strong. We saw in other lines, the bishop could come to a6 and completely take away white's castling ability. So I think this chapter does a really good job of highlighting the imbalances that we get in the Caro-Kann and how we can exploit those in our favor.
Yeah, and from the other angle, when white has the bishop pair, when we tend to take f3 with our light square bishop, we look to lock down the position and make it all about one of white's weaknesses, typically the pawn on d4. So I agree with Jesse. This is a great line to really focus on the minor piece imbalances and figure out, how do I open up the bishops? When do I want to close the position to keep the knights stronger than the bishops?
Yeah. Do we have one more line to cover?
That's the last one. That
We
concludes our
did it.
10 lines. Yep.
Cool. Well, you saw chapter one here, including 10 lines. We have, is it 10 chapters of opening theory, and then another chapter that we'll do model games. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And in the description, we will put a link to the Chess Goals site where you can get more information on our Caro-Kann course.
Yep, and each chapter is going to look a lot like this one. Different lines, of course, but we're going to leave you with plans with each at the end of each line. We're going to have similar plans, similar piece placement based on the setup that white chooses, and we're going to have a video talking through all of it the whole way through.
So thanks for watching this chapter, and we'll see you guys in the next one.